Think you've experienced snow? Think again.
Many houses literally buried in deep drifts.
Just 17 months after the end of the Second World War, Britain faced a new peril.
People were hoping that a better future was just ahead, and then suddenly, nature dealt this body blow.
This time, the military weren't dropping bombs, but bread.
The RAF has made many gallant attempts to bring relief to isolated villages suffering from lack of food.
Equivalent to 5 beasts from the east, one after the other, it lasted 7 long weeks.
England, digging out of the worst winter in half a century, faces a crisis.
My father went at 3 o'clock one morning in order to get to work, and it took him about 4 or 5 hours to get there.
Temperatures below minus 21 degrees Celsius caused coal queues.
Industry ran on coal, and every household had to have coal.
Frozen railways.
Somebody came up with a bright idea. Why don't we put a jet engine on the back of a wagon and we'll blow the snow away?
Power cuts.
Once again, the blackout envelops Britain.
Families thrown together.
My parents decided to leave our home and move in with my grandfather and my uncle and aunt.
Workers sent home.
An entire nation teeters on the brink of economic disaster.
A farming crisis.
Mountain sheep come down to the towns in search of food, while others are still being dug out of deep drifts.
But for children, there was fun to be had, and Brits were determined to help each other.
Nobody wanted a neighbour to freeze to death. It was, if you like, the Blitz spirit all over again.
Everybody was so stoic.
I don't know how he survived, really.
It was a winter like we'll never see again.
Enter 1947, and it definitely became a wild revel.
Brits saw in 1947 with optimism.
The ending of one of the grimmest periods in history, coupled with the hopes and aspirations for the new year.
The war was over. Loved ones had returned home. It was a time for fun and frivolity. Even the weather was in party mood.
January had started off quite mild, quite pleasant.
The air was incredibly balmy. I mean, January, you expect temperatures to be 4, 5, 6 degrees Celsius. Well, they were climbing into the mid-teens.
People were thinking, winter's done for, it's nearly spring.
But a storm was brewing, and Britain was ill-prepared.
Immediately after the war, times were very tough.
1947 was perhaps the worst possible moment to have a sort of climactic emergency, really. We had poured absolutely everything we had as a nation and as individuals into the war. It was all gone.
The Labour government, led by Clement Attlee, had just begun a raft of sweeping reforms designed to prop up British industry.
I think everybody now realises that our standard of life depends on what we can produce, and that labour is the source of our well-being.
There was a big rescue act for British industry and British commerce, which had been battered, obviously, during a 6-year war.
Food was scarce. Rationing was tighter than it had been during the war.
The luxuries were things like if you could have fried spam. My God, if you get fried spam, that was really going it a bit.
I used to get hundreds and thousands and eat them with my finger, dip my finger in, and things like that, because you couldn't get sweets.
Britain relied on foreign aid from its former colonies.
Today, England is so short of cheese that it's a luxury. These packets will help to ease the shortage.
And domestic life was hard.
The thing about 1947, the whole existence was different in so many ways from the normality of this century.
We weren't used to things like central heating and television and anything like that, you know.
There were no luxuries at all.
And there was another reason why Britain wasn't prepared for one of the worst winters of the 20th century. By today's standards, weather forecasting was primitive.
Here's what goes on at the Air Ministry's biggest Met station at Dunstable, Bedfordshire. Temperature, rainfall, winds, everything from anticyclones to sunspots. They keep tabs on them all at Dunstable.
I'm in total admiration for the earliest forecasters because we're going back to a time where there was no satellite imagery. That happened in 1960. There was no computer modelling. That happened in the 50s. Most of the forecasts were based around observations. Obviously, you had weather balloons were really handy because you can see the profile of the atmosphere, and it's using those observations to pinpoint and almost join the dots. And it was good probably for 24 hours, 48 hours, depending on the weather patterns. But it was more about nowcasting rather than forecasting.
Towards the end of January 1947, the mild weather across Britain took a turn for the worse.
The first frosts arrived on the 20th of January, so that would have been a bit of a shock to the system, but it got really cold on the 21st, rapidly cold.
On the morning of January the 23rd, Brits still had no idea of what was to come. Instead, the newspaper headlines were about rationing. More tinned beef, but less beer. And as for the weather...
The forecast said cold weather persisting for at least several days. We had absolutely no idea what was going to hit us.
That evening, snow began falling across Britain. It wouldn't let up for 7 weeks.
It came in from the southwest, all courtesy of an area of cloud and rain which turned readily to snow. And many communities across the southwest peninsula got cut off because of the snow. There was up to 7 inches in places.
Remarkably, even the Isles of Scilly, you know, bathed in the warm, mild Atlantic Ocean, had snowfall for the first time in many, many years.
Winter sports were in full swing when we visited Hampstead Heath, and a great time was had by all who cared to risk a few bruises on the local Cresta run. Whoops.
Overnight, much of grey post-war Britain was wrapped in a blanket of pristine white snow. For children, it was a gift from the heavens.
In snowy conditions of that kind, young kids have a whale of a time. And I did. It was, for me, a winter wonderland.
Skating and sliding has been in full swing in St James's Park. And if that notice means anything, somebody will make a nice profit out of the weather.
In Leeds, 6-year-old John Craven was taking full advantage.
We all had little snowball gangs and things like that. We had a wonderful time. The parents didn't worry. They just let us go and enjoy ourselves in the white wonderland. My dad made me a sort of makeshift sledge, and there was a road which had a very steep hill, and we used to go sledging like mad, high speed down this the ice on this road, and there was no problem with traffic at the time because there were hardly any cars around. The only problem was getting back up the hill again because it was so icy and slippy. You kept falling on your face pulling your sledge.
For Britain's children, it was a rare chance to forget the hardships of post-war Britain and focus on fun.
We used to go to the cinema with our parents, and we'd seen the news, and we'd seen the Russians repulsing the Germans at the end of the Second World War in snow.
First, a story of this winter's Soviet offensive. A Russian patrol checks up on German frontline positions.
So as soon as the snow came down, we had the idea, we kids, to enact that. And we were Russians going from pile to pile in the snow, firing at an imaginary German.
But as the snow continued to fall across Britain, it began to cause problems. And that initial joy soon turned to dread.
When it first started snowing, it was only a bit of snow, so that was fine. When it started to get above the top of your Wellingtons, then you started to think this is really something big. And it went on and on and on. And nobody had any idea when it was going to stop.
What happened during the winter of 1947 was something almost extraordinary, almost something where you could blame the gods, because in a lifetime, something like that never happened.
By Saturday, January the 25th, 1947, snow had been falling across much of southern England for 3 days. It was 6 inches deep in Suffolk and 9 inches in parts of Kent. As temperatures plunged, roads across the south were badly affected, and Yorkshire's fishing fleet was stuck in port. But Britain's children were having a whale of a time.
When I look back on 47, which is actually a sort of almost rose-tinted image from childhood of what it was like, that was the best snow ever.
And the snow also offered Johnny Ball an opportunity to mimic this moment of slapstick from his comedy heroes.
In those days, we used to watch Laurel and Hardy especially, and I was always a fan of theirs. Building sites, for us kids, were adventure playgrounds. And when it snowed, it really snowed so much that we could see that the trenches that were a metre deep were completely covered in snow. So we actually played the joke, and we'd walk along nonchalantly and disappear down a hole in the snow.
But that initial childhood joy soon faded when, during that opening weekend of wintry weather, the big snow claimed its first victims.
There was a great temptation, especially if you were a child, to try your luck on the ice in a pond. And, in fact, 4 children drowned after falling through the ice. Tragic.
And there was more tragedy that weekend when a plane taking off from Croydon Airport in snow crashed.
The Dakota airliner burst into flames and 12 of the 23 occupants lost their lives.
An investigation found snow and ice on the wings may have been partly to blame, as well as poor visibility.
It wasn't a pure anticyclone giving settled cold and crisp conditions. So it was dark, it was dreary, it was bitter. This was a real lethal icy spell.
By January the 27th, after 5 days of snow and ice, newspapers were reporting villages being isolated by snowdrifts, and much of the country looked like this.
Icy winds, heavy frost, and quite a bit of snow. That's what it's been like in Britain lately, as you've probably noticed.
In Kent, 100 miles of roads were blocked.
Couldn't see friends, neighbours, couldn't travel any distance.
Country buses were still running when we took our pictures, but some people like to be independent.
I remember just feeling, oh, we can always walk there, and then realising that, I'm sorry, you really can't. We can't actually move. And that was quite worrying.
The Isle of Sheppey was completely cut off. Snow on parts of the only road to the island was 8 feet deep.
Our cameraman found snow ploughs at work on some of the roads, which were also being cleared by hand. A cold job, and one that's being repeated in many other parts of Britain under snow.
In the Peak District, a young Amanda Barry tried to help her family drive across the moors.
My stepfather had a Riley, and I had a big running board, which was one good thing, because I could stand on the running board and try and get them over the moors. Going just, no, keep going, no, not to the left, keep going. No, 2 minutes later, you would be in a snowdrift.
So, what had caused this sudden change in the weather?
The air across Finland and Sweden, Denmark, Norway was getting colder and colder and colder. So this high pressure was just becoming more and more dense and stubborn and was extending its icy claws in every direction. The initial setup was similar to Beast from the East, with the Scandinavian high, the easterlies, and then some milder air trying to get in from the south. But the Beast from the East was, you know, a matter of days, not 55 days.
And to compare the two is ridiculous.
Snow on trees, in drifts, on railways. We've been over it, under it, through it, and like you, we're sick of it.
As we progressed through January, the winter weather just would not let up. Temperatures were so low, they were lower than what they would be in any kitchen freezer. So we saw temperatures in Essex dip down to minus 20 degrees Celsius. I mean, you die in exposure for that, you get frostbite. So icy that some parts of the Thames froze over. Some parts of the sea had ice on it. So that's how cold it was.
By the start of February, hundreds of remote northern farms and villages were cut off.
People were really knocked over by how extreme the situation was, praying that it was going to end, but we didn't see any indication of it.
From every side, the UK was getting pretty much bombarded by icy weather. It was almost just like an Arctic hell in the UK.
But whilst adults battled against the elements, Britain's children continued to take advantage.
I can remember every day we used to have to go out and shovel away the snow from the path in front of the house. So in no time at all, we had a sort of wall of snow building up on the roadside. And we dug ourselves big holes into these snow walls, which we used as kind of igloos.
The country was starting to resemble an Arctic wilderness, with igloos popping up everywhere. Who could have imagined that Britain would be home to so many? But none could have been more carefully constructed than the one built by 4-year-old Neil Kinnock's father and uncle.
Being coal miners, they made sure the roof was safe by propping it up with maybe 2 shovels, certainly 1 shovel that I can clearly remember, because they would always be immensely vigilant about a safe roof.
Across Britain, the biting easterly winds whipped up the snow into blinding blizzards. In places, it was a complete whiteout.
It was quite difficult to make your way from one step to another in very deep snow, because it was continuous. And you just thought, if you could just let up for a minute, I could make my way to this next lamppost. But it didn't.
The snow was already building, with drifts, enormous drifts, up to 23 feet high. Now that is as tall as a 2-story building.
Some villages in the Peak District almost disappeared completely.
Up north, the little town of Padfield continues to face a spectacular ordeal by snow, with many houses literally buried in deep drifts. Some of the snow is cleared to let daylight into the bedrooms, while Padfield folk somehow manage to keep cheerful in spite of it all.
Just a mile from Padfield, Amanda Barry was staying at her grandfather's remote bungalow.
I was in bed with my mother because I think we'd sat up all night talking as we usually did. We said, well, it's not time to get up because it's dark. We said, oh, we should go back to sleep for a bit. So we went back to sleep. We went, oh, it's told me it's still dark. And it went on being dark because what we hadn't realised was the snow, because we were on the side of a hill, had just snowed over us. So there weren't any windows, basically, that we could see out of, so it was still dark. And then we realised we couldn't open the front door. Anyway, the farmer came up because he realised that we were in, and he dug us out.
The winter of 1982 saw similar chaos and some snowdrifts 20 feet deep.
In the isolated villages of Wales, people are running short of heating fuels and food and medical supplies are gradually running out. This digger has moved just 20 yards in 2 days.
Also dubbed the Big Snow, the country suffered recurring blizzards for 2 months. And during 2018's Beast from the East, the Welsh valleys were hit hard. Snowdrifts buried cars. But when it comes to the sheer volume of snow, the winter of 1947 remains unparalleled.
The snow repeatedly drifted up against the front of the houses, up to bedroom level, and in some cases right up to roof level. And because so many of the men in the street were miners or ex-miners, they did what miners do and dug tunnels. One of my strongest memory, wrapped up against the cold in my shorts and my Wellington boots, was being able to go up and down the street under the snow. And I distinctly remember this kind of bluey white light and being able to walk up and down to our neighbors' houses and play with the kids in these tunnels.
The worst spell of weather for 50 years. We hope it'll be 50 more before we get another.
By early February, Brits were growing weary of the big snow.
The blast of snow and ice and sub-zero temperatures was like something that nobody had ever experienced before. But the big freeze was only just getting started. And the very last thing that Brits wanted was the government to turn the power off.
By the start of February 1947, Britain had already endured more than a week of heavy snow and plunging temperatures, and the country had begun to grind to a standstill.
Scenes in the Midlands tell their own story of what's been happening on the roads of Britain.
Everything came to a halt. Going to work became an adventure. Getting home from work became a real challenge.
This really was a hammer blow to the entire country.
The AA reported that nearly all roads in Great Britain were covered with snow and ice.
Every Sunday we used to like to go across the city to visit my old granny. But it was difficult getting to the bus stop to start with, and then there was no guarantee that the buses would run. Often they didn't.
Bulldozers, by the way, evidently make excellent snow ploughs, but chipping the ice off roads after the snow's gone seems an almost hopeless task.
Because it was so cold, there was a freezing amount of ice on the ground. So the snow was falling on top of ice, making it incredibly treacherous.
But in 1947, working from home wasn't an option.
My father worked in the steelworks. He went at 3 o'clock one morning in order to get to work. And it took him about 4 or 5 hours to get there over the mountain. He did a 12-hour shift and then walked back. That was pretty typical of millions of men in that winter.
And Britain's emergency services had no choice but to carry on.
In Keighley, a 75-year-old woman was pulled on a sledge for 2 miles to try and get her to hospital. In Wensleydale, 2 doctors walked for 9 hours in blizzard conditions to try and reach a 9-year-old girl who was suffering from appendicitis.
But it was disruption to the railways that hit Britain hardest.
Inevitably, the rail network collapsed, so getting from A to B became almost impossible.
The nation relied on the railway. The food's delivered by the railway, the coal's delivered by the railway, passengers are delivered by railway, animal feeds are delivered by railway.
The railway did everything because there were no motorways. So when you paralyse the country with these snowdrifts, like there was, there is only one thing you can do, and that's you've got to unblock the railways.
Snowplough trains were used to try to clear the tracks.
They would have two engines, a snowplough at the front and a snowplough at the back, and they would back up for up to a mile, 3/4 mile, then whack the engine into forward gear, and then hit that bank of snow up between 35 and 45 miles an hour. And in the front of those snowplows, there were men, you know, guiding it to make sure that it's unbelievable. Nobody would do it today. The health and safety committees would have a heart attack.
Even the snowplough trains were getting stuck in these massive depths of snow. There were reports of people being stranded in trains for days on end.
Here's one method, perhaps a trifle primitive, of clearing the line.
In many cases, the only option was to dig the trains out by hand.
German prisoners of war have been trying to keep the lines clear for the coal trains.
We used prisoners of war to manually dig the snow, but with that strong easterly wind, gales coming in from the east, they never stopped.
The snow's higher than they are, and they're throwing this snow up, and they're doing this day after day. You know, their muscles must have been, it's unbelievable. You just think about it now, and it's like, how do they do this?
In a desperate attempt to help, the authorities began brainstorming. In Europe, dynamite was used. But us Brits came up with something a bit more sophisticated.
One idea was to mount two jet aero engines on trucks and half melt, half blow the snow away.
So somebody came up with a bright idea. Why don't we put a jet engine on the back of a wagon and get a locomotive to move that along, and we'll blow the snow away. We have to understand that everybody was desperate. So when desperation is, you know, your norm, you'll try anything.
Reports say the experiment was successful. It certainly looks it anyway.
But the news reports were premature.
Well, of course, it doesn't work. It blows the snow away, but the heat buckles the rails. You know? It's not going to take a genius to know what happens to steel if you heat it up.
By February the 6th, the disruption to the railways had led to a shortage of coal.
Britain in the 1940s ran on coal. It was everywhere and essential everywhere.
At places, people queued through night and early morning in freezing conditions to get a little coke to carry on.
Coal was still the main form of heating in houses, and if there isn't enough, that means you can't heat your home.
Everybody had a coal fire. We had no central heating, and you relied on coal. The whole nation did.
Industry ran on coal, electricity was produced from coal, and every household had to have coal. That was life.
Even before the snow arrived, stocks were running low.
In the last couple of years of the war, 10% of all conscripted men, 10% were sent down the mines rather than to the front lines, producing enough to keep the engine of Britain rolling. By 1947, however, many of them were going home. Our coal production was sliding down and down and down. Not our consumption, we still wanted it, but we were not producing enough coal to keep us going.
During the big snow, the army were, once again, sent in to help.
These scenes are being repeated at many collieries, where troops and civilians are working together, loading up the army lorries.
But it was too little, too late.
Coal mines, idle because of the storms, point dramatically to Britain's scarcity of fuel.
My great-uncle was a coalman, and he had a wonderful old cart horse called Sam, I remember. And he and Sam didn't get out much at all that winter because A, he couldn't get coal supplies, and B, Sam couldn't cope with the hills all around because the ice was making him slide down again. So he didn't have any coal to deliver for getting on for 3 months.
London, caught with only 1 week's supply of fuel, unloads a weather-beaten collier of its last trickle of precious coal. And barges carrying some of the dwindling supplies are blocked off in ice-jammed canals.
Fearing the shortage would result in cuts to the supply of electricity, the chairman of London's largest supplier appealed for help.
This is the most serious blow that's ever befallen British industry in its long history. It is your job and my job to save fuel, especially electricity, in all ways and at all times.
Many did exactly that.
My parents decided almost at the outset of the blizzards to leave our home and move in with my grandfather and my uncle and aunt in order to conserve food and energy, and most specifically coal.
But by February the 7th, with temperatures rarely getting above freezing and snow typically a foot deep, power cuts were common, leaving families without electricity and gas.
The power shutdown brings out candles in offices and homes throughout the land. Once again, the blackout envelops Britain.
I can remember we had a good stock of candles. And I remember my dad reading me bedtime stories by candlelight.
Just imagine for a minute, 25 feet snowdrifts, minus 23 at night, no sunshine, no central heating, no double glazing, and now power cuts sweeping the country. It was pretty grim.
This temporary stoppage obviously means a heavy loss in exports, and of course there's always the danger of unemployment.
Industry too was hit hard.
Much of the news of the coal shortage, some might call it a crisis, has centred on the Austin Motor Works, Birmingham.
In 1947, the Austin Motor Works factory in Birmingham produced almost a third of Britain's cars. But when it ran out of coal, it closed. 14,000 workers were sent home until further notice.
But how are you affected by this coal shortage, Mr. Bird, directly? Well, we require 1,800 tonnes per week to keep this plant in full production.
As so often is the case in crises, it was the poor who really suffered most. There was a massive spike in unemployment, and even if you managed to hang on to a job, the chances were you wouldn't be working full-time. They were suddenly having to manage through the most difficult time of the year with far less money.
Freezing weather, heavy snows, and an extreme shortage of coal have paralyzed the country. Transportation is seriously disrupted. An entire nation teeters on the brink of economic disaster.
2 million people were laid off. The country was grinding to a halt and taking a serious economic hit at the same time.
From number 10 Downing Street, Prime Minister Attlee decrees nationwide reductions in the use of coal and electricity.
On the 10th of February, the government decided its only option was to ration electricity.
And when the nation was literally threatened with disaster, the power cut was ordered.
A lot of people thought, why a cut? Is this a time to cut the power when we need the power urgently? And of course, it was the only possible way.
The government had no choice but to initiate a series of rolling power cuts. It started by 5 hours a day power cuts in London, into the Midlands and the North West, and in the end, those power cuts were rolled out across the whole of the UK.
In places where work could be done, it was done by the flickering light of candles. In many cafes and eating houses, it was the same. Traffic lights went out. Entertainment, of course, was severely restricted. Only essential workers, as those in hospitals, for example, were still permitted full use of light and power.
I remember every night we sort of huddle around a fire, trying to keep warm, and we'd have a hot meal if the electricity was on and the gas was on, or we'd have just sandwiches.
In some shops, workers wrapped in heavy clothes carry on a feeble production.
One factory even turned to pedal power in a desperate attempt to stay open.
Here, for instance, a bicycle drives a compressor during switch-off periods, saving the output of 23 workers.
The entertainment industry was also affected.
To heighten the sense of misery, BBC TV services ended to conserve electricity. Theatres were closed, cinemas were closed, but at least the British Film Festival went ahead.
London's horribly cold weather entirely failed to deter film fans from crowding Leicester Square to see the stars arrive for the British Film Festival.
Everybody arriving in their overcoats. I mean, there wasn't a red carpet. It looked like they needed a red flannel blanket around them.
I also had the pleasure of being there and meeting many friends in the film world, including the irrepressible Tessie O'Shea.
Well, I must say, it's nice to see that the cold spell doesn't affect you, Tessie. All wrapped up and somewhere to go, eh?
Don't ask me to take this off, Lionel. I've got the curlers in.
By mid-February, Britain was experiencing one of the worst winters ever recorded.
It was already the snowiest period of weather since 1814. And people were thinking, well, you know, it can't possibly go on any longer, it can't get any worse.
Just when we thought it couldn't possibly get any colder, it did.
By mid-February 1947, the Big Freeze had been raging for 3 long weeks. Coal shortages had left many Brits without heat or power, and now some were running out of food. Pack ice in the North Sea was hitting Britain's fishing fleet.
Here at Lowestoft, the ice-covered trawlers returned from their Arctic voyages, having faced some of the worst hazards that many of their crews can remember.
And Britain's farmers were on the brink.
Well, the big snow really affected Britain's farming industry. Crops, especially the root crops, frozen in the ground. In some places, farmers used pneumatic drills to try and get the veggies out of the ground. And of course, livestock suffered terribly.
Here on Ilkley Moor, mountain sheep come down to the towns in search of food, while others are still being dug out of deep drifts.
Shepherds were in tears as they tried to rescue their sheep from the drifts, and they just couldn't. A lot of cattle died as well. It was a terrible time.
Farming was decimated. 2 million sheep lost their lives. 500,000 acres of winter wheat was destroyed, and the potato crop was ruined.
Even before the Big Freeze, food was in short supply. Bread had been rationed just 6 months earlier.
I get up wondering what I'm going to give the boys to eat, and the stuff I have to put in front of their father doesn't bear thinking about.
Food in 1947 was, well, there wasn't much of it. In 1947 was actually more tightly rationed, considerably more tightly rationed, than it had been during the war.
Toast and dried egg breakfasts aren't much to shout about, but now even they're going.
You couldn't choose what you had to do for dinner. You had to have what was available. You didn't waste it because there wouldn't be any seconds. That's why everybody looks so flipping skinny in all that footage, because they're not eating much.
Here is a comparison of the Australian and English food rations. Health-giving butter is down to 2 ounces a week, while the small margarine allowance has been reduced a further ounce.
I mean, the amount of butter you got for a week is about the amount you would probably expect to have at a rather poor restaurant on the side of your plate to have a bit of cheese with, you know. I mean, it was nothing.
I remember food was scarce. There were always tips on how to eke out your food. Mum had to use barley to stretch things out, and barley used to make me cockle, and I couldn't stand it. But she had to use barley to eke out the rations.
So when the big snow hit, Britain faced the very real prospect of a frozen famine.
Food couldn't get through to towns and villages which were becoming cut off. So at times it was becoming quite desperate. Rural parts of the UK were getting close to starvation.
So just as it did a few years earlier during the war, Britain turned to the RAF for help.
Here at Fairford in Gloucestershire, ground crews are busy loading containers with essential supplies to be dropped to snowbound Midland communities cut off from all communication with the outside world.
Loaded on board, not bombs, but bread.
World War II bombers were used to airdrop food. That is how severe the situation had become.
But on February the 13th, one of the bombers dropping aid got into trouble.
Bear in mind, these aircraft were flying in really atrocious weather conditions, and inevitably one did crash with 8 fatalities.
A gallant crew who had laid down their lives in the service of their fellow men.
But despite the dangers, Brits were determined to help each other through the crisis.
I remember a huge feeling of neighbourliness during the Great Snow. Nobody wanted a neighbour to freeze to death. So people would pop into your house saying, "Are you okay? Everything fine? Got enough fuel? Got enough food?" It was, if you like, the Blitz spirit all over again.
People in 1947 had a lot of experience to draw on. They had been through a world war. So many people were able to draw on that.
Good heavens, Hitler's threat hadn't broken them. The bombing hadn't broken them. So, no, a little bit of cold weather, they could put up with that. Everybody was so stoic. We were not depressed at all. We were cheerful. And I don't remember any austerity ever dampening our spirits, ever.
And there was a sense of, you know, we need to dust ourselves down and try and get on with this. Yorkshire postmen walking for over 100 miles in a week, refusing to give way, wanting to get the post through people's letterboxes, even in the most remote villages and hamlets across the county. The post must get through was the motto.
There's the one good thing about human beings, that they do pull together when there's a disaster.
By late February, that wartime spirit was being tested once more as temperatures continued to tumble.
Not only is the weather bitter, it gets even colder. The air just sitting over the land, over a cold surface, which was the snow and ice. You know, temperatures plummeting sub -20.
Even if you were used to toughing it out through a British winter with no heating, this was something beyond what you knew what to deal with.
I woke up every morning knowing that this awful cold was enveloping me.
I remember in the morning getting up and having to scrape the ice off the inside of the window.
Now you put central heating on. They didn't have any of those things in 1947. They gave out service medals, but they didn't give them to you until you were able to get into bed without screaming with cold as you went down the sheets that were like sliding into a refrigerator.
I remember hands being a particular problem. We got chilblains and stupidly thought we could cure the chilblains by taking hot mugs of coffee and that sort of thing, and which made your hands, of course, blister and be very painful.
The ends of your fingers, you sort of feel as though they're dropping off. We just shivered in this Siberian climate.
I mean, I don't know how we survived, really.
In the Peak District, the natural water supply froze, leaving families with little option but to use snow instead.
We got snow and we scooped it up, melted it down a bit, then it got boiled a bit. So we got some water that way for, I think, for sort of washing up purposes more than anything else.
Meanwhile, in Coventry, the Waterman family were busy looking after a noisy newborn.
When my parents and my grandparents were alive, every birthday had the story of how I was born in the middle of the worst snowstorm in 100 years, and my dad was in the loft shoveling out the snow so it didn't fall on my mum.
In fact, Britain was at the height of a post-war baby boom.
At the Food Office, More babies mean longer queues for new ration books and a record rush too on priority baby foods.
We see a huge spike in the number of births in this immediate post-war period. People are getting married like there's no tomorrow, and they are producing like there's no tomorrow.
You could almost spot when my dad was demobbed, along with everybody else, which is why, of course, 47 was the big year of births, because all the soldiers came home, and you can tell because we're all born exactly 9 months later.
So when the winter of 1947 hits, there are a lot of mothers with tiny, nappy-wearing babies. My heart goes out to them. How on earth did they cope? This is a day before disposables. They've all got to be washed. How? With next to no coal to heat your water, with water that's frozen solid in many places. How the heck do you manage a baby and keep your child clean and safe in those sorts of circumstances? The work involved and the worry.
And for many women, life at work was just as hard.
The winter of 1947 had massive consequences for my family. My mother was a district nurse, and she went to work every single day. And as a consequence, at some time, I guess in February, got pneumonia, and she didn't stop work. She kept on working, which meant that she got a second bout, and it inflicted asthma on her, which eventually, in the early 1970s, killed her. So her dedication cost her life, I guess.
The worst snowfall since 1965 has brought much of Britain to a standstill.
In December 2010, temperatures threatened to reach 1947 levels when the mercury in North Yorkshire plunged to -20. But by comparison, that freeze-up was short-lived. And on February the 25th, 1947, the temperature in Bedfordshire fell to -21 degrees Celsius.
There weren't many lighter notes in this winter, but the polar bears at Whipsnade Zoo were loving every minute of it. -21. They must have thought that overnight they'd been transported back to the Arctic.
Temperatures were so low that school milk was turning into ice cream.
We used to be given little bottles of free milk, and the cream on top of the bottle used to pop out, and like a cream lolly on top of the milk, and we used to lick away at our cream lollies before we drank the milk.
And in Bradford, the freezing temperatures gave one woman a rather nasty shock.
Put a false teeth in a glass of water by the bed. Woke up the next morning and the false teeth had frozen in that tumbler of water, which gives you an idea of just how freezing cold it was inside some of these houses. February turned out to be the coldest since records began way back in 1659.
And the snow just kept on falling. In some parts, 26 out of the 28 days, there was falling snow. It's just a dark tunnel of ice and blasting winds.
The only cold that I've ever experienced that compares was when I went to Southeast Siberia to make a television program where it was 50 degrees below. It was so cold that it stopped Kinnock speaking. That takes some doing.
By March the 10th, Britain had spent almost 7 weeks at the mercy of the big snow. But then came a change.
At long last, the temperature eventually started to rise, but that just caused some of the worst flooding that this country has ever seen.
On March the 10th, 1947, after 7 weeks of snow and ice, Britain's Arctic weather began to change.
Inevitably, winter came to an end, and the jet stream eventually won through, bringing mild and wet weather up from the southwest.
There was a morning when I thought, Why aren't I feeling really cold? Why do I feel I can actually put one leg out of bed and not feel that it's encased in snow?
But the milder air had a sting in its tail.
We've had about 55 days in all of snow and ice and wind and temperatures which have never been recorded ever before. How much frozen water is sitting on the land of the UK?
The meltwater just rushed off the land and flooded everything.
After Britain's coldest spell for over 50 years, come the biggest road floods in living memory.
In London, the River Lee burst its banks.
Cathay cameramen are there for the rescue of people trapped in their waterlogged homes. By rowing boat and punts, police and firemen work to evacuate marooned people.
As bad as the winter was for snow and ice, and as depressing as it was, in many ways the flooding caused much more misery. This was real hardship. This was people's homes being completely wrecked by a wall of floodwater.
Across the country, railway workers, still exhausted from clearing snow, now work to repair the tracks from flood damage. On March the 15th, floodwater swept into London's Lea Bridge waterworks, contaminating the supply and leaving around 1 million people in the East End without fresh water. But the cinema newsreels did their best to keep up morale.
Without delay, fleets of tanker lorries went into action and were soon hard at it dealing with urgent needs and bringing back memories of the Blitz. Anyway, the same cheery smiles were still there as Londoners coped with just one more crisis.
You heard the voice there because being British, we'll stare on. We'll turn it into something good. The English voices that were used at that time to tell us that everything was perfectly all right, and there we were, you know. We weren't.
In the neighbourhood of Windsor, Runnymede and Staines, roads have been as much as 3 feet underwater in some places.
Flooding was reported in 30 English counties and some areas of Wales, and parts of the Thames rose to record levels.
It was a strange time. You just had got over one crisis when another one popped along.
All the time, evacuation has been going on as the waters rose higher still. Some of the riverside dwellers still managed to get about, but they don't know where they'd be without the Thames Valley's new bus.
We suddenly found that there were an amazing number of boats, and people could use them to go and do their shopping and come back and live on the top floor and eat their scrambled eggs.
In Kent, the River Medway also burst its banks.
The Medway has been overflowing and Maidstone itself has been underwater. Flooding from the river has been extensive and damage to property has been mounting.
The daily flow of water during the thaw was 61.7 billion litres. For the millions of people being impacted by this, it meant the loss of their homes, the loss of their livelihoods, the loss of their crops. This was a devastating event which swept across the whole of the UK. The thaw was vicious, it was rapid, and it annihilated many communities.
It turned out to be some of the worst flooding that the country has ever experienced.
But once again, Brits tried to make the best of it.
This is one way of delivering the milk at any rate.
The British spirit sort of came together yet again. The milkmen delivering milk on a pole through people's bedroom windows because there was 6 foot of floodwater which had completely wrecked the lower half of the house. So people were just trying to get on with things and just trying to see through what was a dreadful time.
This is just another appalling challenge sent to be endured. And it literally was a matter of keep calm and carry on.
Nowhere was that Blitz spirit needed more than in East Anglia's low-lying fens.
That's the breach caused by the overflowing of the Great Ouse near Erith in Huntingdonshire. Already it's caused disastrous flooding of the fens.
Homes and farms were evacuated.
Well, Mrs. Gudgeon, you seem to have had a very frightening time. Tell me what happened last night.
Oh, we were just ready to go to bed when police came and asked us to get hubby, who was an invalid, up. and get him out from the banks here into a gentleman's institute at Prickwillow.
So you really had to get out in a big hurry?
Yes.
What about you, Mrs. Benstead? What were you doing?
Oh, I was sat knitting when I had a knock come at the door, so I grabbed the 3 children out, and we couldn't dress them. We just put some warm woolies on, and the wind was too strong, and we had some kind people from Ely took us in a car.
Winds had whipped up floodwaters into waves that had breached the dikes, creating an inland sea and flooding rich farmland.
By night, searchlights illuminate a tragic scene as some of Britain's richest agricultural land becomes an ever-widening sea of desolation.
The government issued a £1 million grant to help flood victims, and Canada sent food parcels to stricken villages in Suffolk. Meanwhile, it was a race against time to repair the dikes.
24 hours a day, troops, prisoners of war and civilian workers labour to close the gaps and bring relief to the surrounding villages and to the farmland so vital to our national food production.
Thousands of soldiers, British soldiers, Polish soldiers, German prisoners of war, were drafted in with pumps to try and get the water off the fens. And in fact, they did a brilliant job.
And the army brought up their amphibious Neptune tanks by night. In bitterly cold weather, searchlights lit up the scene as tanks and tarpaulins were placed in position. Reinforcements consisted of sandbags laid all round on the upstream side of the Neptunes.
But constant rain hampered their efforts.
This turned out to be the wettest March on record, and for many, a very, very miserable month.
Specialist machinery was sent from the Netherlands and expert engineers flown in.
The government were paranoid about starvation going forward because, of course, you know, this was arable land. This is the breadbasket of the UK, if you like, and they were really, really worried about what was coming down the road once the floodwaters had gone and once the snow had melted. Would there be enough food to feed the British public?
The government was doing its best to try and bring in food supplies from around the world, and there were government ministers who were scouring the world for sources of food.
The floods were estimated to have cost Britain up to £4.5 billion in today's prices.
It was a terrible time, and it took farming a few years to recover from that blow.
But the winter of 1947 wasn't done yet.
As if Mother Nature couldn't throw anything else at the UK, there was one final kick in the teeth.
On March the 16th, 1947, just days after some of the worst floods in living memory, Britain was hit by yet another climatic event.
As if Mother Nature couldn't throw anything else at the UK, there was one final kick in the teeth, because when the mild air eventually won through, it was down to a very intense area of low pressure which swept across the country. It did bring mild air in, but it brought storm-force winds.
In St John's Wood, 2 people lost their lives when a chimney stack fell through the house.
It was an intense windstorm. It packed a punch. This was a beast, and this was the beast from the west, because it came in and it completely pounded into the UK with winds up to 100 miles an hour.
In the stricken fens, the gales whipped up the recent floodwater into waves, which crashed into houses and barns. As the water rose once more, livestock desperately scrambled for higher ground.
As the water swirled into their farmyards, families were moved to safety with all they could carry, and from barns and byres, the rescuers salvaged all they could.
In total, 15 people were killed, and many more were injured. The storm marked the end of one of the worst winters of the 20th century. Statistically, the Big Freeze of 1963 was the coldest, with temperatures dipping below 22 degrees Celsius. It lasted for nearly 3 months. But 1947 was the snowiest winter of the 20th century, and for many, the worst.
It certainly was the most extreme winter that I think anybody or any of our family have ever had to contemplate. And certainly there's never been anything like that in our lives since.
We all grew up with the same stories from our parents and our grandparents about how tough this was and how we were born in this amazing freak weather and how they cope with it.
We've had some pretty bad winters since then, but if you've lived through 47, nothing else really counts.
One immediate legacy of that winter was a push for Brits to do more gardening. In April 1947, with farmland still decimated by snow, ice and floodwater, the Minister of Agriculture, Tom Williams, called on townspeople to help feed Britain.
Please don't forget the value of our allotments to our national food supply. And those of you with a back garden can help us materially.
As soon as the ground melted and we could plant seeds again, we all got back to digging for post-victory. I think the BBC started Gardener's Question Time round about then, still going strong today. And so is the gardening spirit. You know, we all have continued to be a nation of gardeners.
The amount of people that had allotments, I think it really sort of took off. They all went off with the cigarettes down to the allotment, newspaper, dog. Sort of very English, actually.
But did 1947 prompt an instant improvement in weather forecasting? Well, in June that year, Pathy News tried to find out.
Our reporter visits the Bartlett brothers, John and Dennis, professional weather forecasters. They're ready to forecast up to 12 months ahead.
12 months ahead.
10 million people will be on holiday in August. What are their chances? Shall we tell him? Well, it's going to be very, very disappointing. Heavy downpours of rain, thunderstorms. I don't think it'll be a really good month at all.
Well, it certainly raised a smile watching that. Shall I break it to them? It was actually one of the best Augusts ever recorded.
I expect you've noticed that Britain, of all places, has been having a heat wave.
After all the devastation of the snow and the floods, we had a beautiful summer.
That summer of 47 was like a payoff. We've gone through all this, thank God. Now we're going to have a great summer.
And during that long, hot summer, Brits had something else to celebrate.
A court circular issued from Buckingham Palace confirmed popular rumour concerning the engagement of Her Royal Highness Princess Elizabeth, heiress presumptive to the throne.
What the nation really needed after the snow and all the flooding was a bit of really good news. And we got it. The nation had its fairy tale princess marrying her fairy tale prince.
The couple tied the knot on November the 20th.
And how they cheered the happy pair when they came out onto the balcony.
A big occasion where everybody got together and cheered and felt a little bit better for it.
It was just a wonderful love match. It was absolutely wonderful. We were all blissfully happy for them because we could see they were happy.
My goodness, this country needed something like that. It was really, really important.
Suitably, the royal wedding took place on the mildest November the 20th ever recorded.
1947 was an absolutely remarkable year. We had the snowiest winter since 1814, the coldest February on record. Those records go back to 1659. The wettest March on record, the worst floods in many areas in living memory. And then what followed was one of the best summers ever recorded. And the Met Office later said that 1947 was unique in meteorological history.
And for the children who experienced that terrible winter, a brighter future was just around the corner.
There was this surge that came up, 50s, 60s, woof, of all that energy.
Along came rock and roll and Elvis and Cliff, and then the swinging 60s were just ahead as well. So the late 40s saw the start of what was going to be much better times.
But the winter of 1947 forever left its mark on those who endured it.
The memory of that cold got into me very, very deeply. I didn't like plays which automatically you assumed there would be a lot of cold involved. I thought, well, I don't like that. I'll do something else.
God forbid that our country, our economy, should ever experience that again.
For people like me who survived that winter of 47, you could throw anything at us and we'd cope.
Really, what they did was heroic, really. I mean, we can't talk highly enough about how they got through this.
Will we get the severity of 47 again? I would say very, very unlikely in a warming world. But I think another severe winter in future is likely, even though they'll become less frequent with time.
Would something like that ever happen again? Well, never say never. Certainly, there would be a lot more warning.